Chapter 11. The Escape of a Princess Pat by George Pearson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Chapter 11. The Way They Have at Giessen. Except for the starving, as I look back now, Giessen was not such a bad camp as such places go. At least it was the best that we were to know. The discipline, of course, was fairly severe, but on the other hand, the commandant did not trouble us a great deal. The petty annoyances were harder to endure. Frequently we would get the "Rouse!" at half-hour intervals by day or night. "Rouse out!" "Rouse in!" and so on. We never knew what our tormentors wanted, but supposed it to be a sympathetic attempt to break our spirit and our nerve by the simple expedient of habitually interfering with our sleep, so that we would become like the Russians. They were mostly utterly broken in spirit, and had the air of beaten dogs, so that they cringed and fawned to their masters. The least punishment meted out for the most trifling offense was 3 days' cells. Some got 10 years for refusing to work in munition and steel factories, particularly British and Canadians. There are large numbers of both who are today serving out sentences of from 18 months to 10 years in the military fortresses of Germany under circumstances of the greatest cruelty. The so-called courts-martial were mockeries of trials. The culprit was simply marched up to the orderly room, received his sentence, and marched away again. He was allowed no defense worthy of the name. Some of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry were warned for work in a munitions factory. When the time came around they were taken away, but refused to work, and so they were knocked about quite a bit. One was shot in the leg and another bayoneted through the hip, and all were sent back to camp, where they were awarded 6 weeks in the punishment camp, known as the Strafe Barracks. This was a long hut, which were 2 rows of stools a few paces apart. The rouse blew the culprits at 5:30. At 6 they were marched to the hut, and made to sit down in 2 rows facing one another, at attention that is, body rigid, head thrown well back, chest out, hands held stiffly at the side, and eyes straight to the front, for 2 hours. Meanwhile the sentries marched up and down the lane, watching for any relaxation or levity. If so much as a face was pulled at a twinkling eye across the way, another day's strafing was added to the penalty. At the end of 2 hours 1 hour's rest was allowed, during which the prisoners could walk about in the hut, but could not lie down. This continued all day until lights out, for 6 weeks. No mail parcels, writing, or exercise was permitted the prisoners during that time, and the already scanty rations were cut. During good behavior we were allowed 2 postcards and 2 letters a month, with 9 lines to the former and 13 to the page of the latter. No more, no less. Each letter had 4 pages of the small private letter size. The name and address counted as a line. Mine was Kriegsfingerhager, Kapke No. 6, Barrack No. A. The writing had to be big and easy to read, and in the letters on 4 sides of the paper. No complaint or discussion of the war was permitted. Fully 1/2 of those written were returned for infringements or fancied ones. Of these rules, sometimes when the censor was irritated, they were merely chucked into the fire, and as they had also to pass the English censor, it was no wonder that many families wondered why their men did not write. We were there for 3 months before our parcels began to arrive. We considered ourselves lucky if we received 6 out of 10 sent, and with half the contents of the 6th intact. In the larger camp the chances of receipt were better. The small camps were merely units attached to and governed by the larger ones, which handled the mail before giving it to the authorities at the smaller ones. Thus, a man who was attached to Giessen camp, although perhaps 100 miles away from it, had to submit to the additional delay and chance of loss and theft included in the censoring of the parcel at Giessen, as well as the actual place of his confinement. This doubled the chances of fault-finding and of theft. Knowing this to be true, I most earnestly recommended the sending of parcels. True, a large proportion of them were not received, but those that are represented the one salvation of the prisoner of war in German hands. So terribly true is this that when we began to receive parcels at irregular intervals, we used regularly to acknowledge to our friends the receipt of parcels which we had never received. This was the low cunning developed by our treatment. If advised that a parcel of tea, sugar, or other luxuries had been sent, and it did not appear after weeks of patient waiting, we knew that we should never see the parcel. Nevertheless, we usually wrote and thanked the donor and acknowledged the receipt, fearful otherwise that he or she would say, "What's the use?" and send it no more, and we were not allowed to tell the truth, that it had been stolen. The first 3 months of our stay at Giessen were probably the worst of all, including as they did the transition period to this life. It seemed then a hell on earth. The slow starvation was the worst. Once in desperation I gave a Frenchman my good boots for his old ones and 2½ marks, and then gave 60 pfennigs of this to the French cook for a bread ration. Again, in going down the hut one day, I spied a flat French loaf cut into 4 pieces, drying on the window-sill. Seizing one piece, I tucked it under my tunic and passed on before the loss was discovered. Some of the British could be seen at times picking over the sour refuse in the barrels. This amused the Germans very much. We endeavored to get cook-house jobs for the pickings to be had, but could not do so. At a later date, when the Canadian Red Cross Lady Parkour, Miss Hamilton Galt, and our families were sending us package regularly, we made out all right. Some English societies were in the habit of sending books, music, and games to prisoners, but none of these ever reached the group with whom I associated, even before our later actions put us quite beyond the German pale. The appeal of Seasmith and the Irish Brigade was made to us. A number of prisoners were taken apart and the matter broached privately to them. Pamphlets on the feeding of Ireland were also distributed. I did not see any one go over, and an Irishman who was detailed with another Canadian and myself on a brickyard fatigue said that they had recruited only 40 in the camp. The whole thing turned out to be a failure. There were 12 of us, all holed on the brickyard job. 3 or 4 shoveled clay into the mixing machine. 2 more filled the little car, which 2 others pushed along the track of the narrow-gauge railroad. We were guarded by 4 civilian Germans of some home defense corps, all of whom labored with us. The 2 trammers used to start the car, hop on the brake behind, and let it run off on its own momentum down the incline to the edge of the bank, where it would be checked for dumping. Sometimes we forgot to brake the car, so that it would ricochet on the flying leap off the end of the track, and so over the dump. The guards would rage and swear, but could prove nothing so long as our fellows did not get too raw and do this too frequently. One day we shovelers decided to add the gaiety of nations. While one attended the guard's attention elsewhere, we slipped a chunk of steel into the mess. There was a grinding crash, and a large cogwheel tore its way through the roof. In a moment the air was full of machinery and German words. It was a proper wreck. The guards ran around gesticulating angrily, tearing at their hair, and threatening us, while we endeavored to look surprised. It is reasonable to suppose that we were unsuccessful, for we were hustled back to the camp and drew 5 days' cells each from the commandant. There was no trial. He merely sentenced us. The United States Ambassador, Gerald, only came to Giessen once in my time there, and that was while I was off at one of the detached camps, so I had no opportunity of observing the result. We knew very little of what was going on in the outside world. The guards were not allowed to converse with us, and if one was known to speak English he was removed. However, they were more or less curious about us, so that a certain amount of clandestine conversation occurred. Some were certain that they were going to win the war. Others said, "England has too much money. Germany will never win." They used frequently to gather the Russians, Belgians, and French together and lecture them on England's sins. They said that England was letting them do all the fighting, bleeding them white of their men and treasures, so as to come out at the end of the war with the balance of power necessary for her plan of threatening Constantinople and the Cynic ports of France. Many were convinced, and this did not add to the pleasantness of our lot. The notorious Continental Times was circled amongst us freely in both French and English editions. It regularly gave us a most appalling list of German victories, and it speculated in abuse of the English. We counted up in 1 month a total of 2,000,000 prisoners captured by the Germans on all fronts. As I have said, Giessen was not the best camp of all, bearing the starvation, but the discipline there was merciless. The laager was enclosed by a high wire fence which we were forbidden to approach within 4 feet of. A Russian sergeant overstepped that mark one day to shout something to a friend in an adjoining laager. The sentry shouted at him. He either failed to hear or did not understand. The sentry killed him without hesitation. A Belgian started over one day with some leftover soup which he proposed giving to the Russians. The sentry would not let him pass. He went back and told his mate. The latter, a kindly little fellow, thinking that the sentry did not understand the nature of the mission, decided to try himself. The sentry stopped him. He attempted to argue. The sentry pushed him roughly back. He struck the German. The latter dropped him with a blow on the head, and, while he lay unconscious, shoved a bayonet into him. It was done quite coolly and methodically, without heat. He was promoted for it. We were told that he had done a good thing, and that we should get the same if we did not behave. A Canadian who was forced to work in a munitions plant, and whose task included the replacing of waste in the wheel boxes of cars, enjoyed himself for a while, lifting the greasy waste out of them, replacing it with sand. He got 10 years for that. The German in charge of our laager stated the Vermont Englander, and lost no opportunity of bulldozing and threatening us. One of the Canadians, who had been in an American navy, was unusually truculent. The German purposely bunted him one day. "Don't do that again." The German repeated the act. The sailor jolted him on the jaw so that he went dreamland for 15 minutes. The prisoner was taken to the guard-room, and we never heard his ultimate fate, but at the ruling rate he was lucky if he got off at 10 years. It is men like this to whom our government and people owe such a debt as may be paid only in a small degree by our insistence after the war that they be given their liberty. A greater glory is theirs than of the soldier. They wrought amongst a world of foes, knowing their certain punishment, but daring it rather than assist the foes' efforts against their country. One day we were told that we must be inoculated in the arm against typhoid. We thought nothing of that, but the next day men began to gather in groups, so that the guards shouted roughly at them, bidding them not to mutter and whisper so. Where the word came from I know not. It may have emanated in the fears of some active imagination, on the chance and truthful word of a guard, flung in derision at some desperate man, or in a kinder mood and in warning. The word was that we were to be inoculated with the germs of consumption. I understand that it appeared also in the papers at home. It seemed horrible beyond words to us. The idea appeared crazy, but was equally on a par with the events we witnessed daily. Myself, I planned to take no chances, if it were humanly possible. We were all ordered to parade for the inoculation. I hid myself with a few others, and so escaped the operation. Nothing was said, so I could only suppose that they had failed to check us up, as it was not in keeping with the German character, as we had come to know it, and to miss an opportunity of corrective punishment, even though the inoculation had been for our own good. It is true that some of the men so inoculated fell prey to consumption. On the other hand, one of them had a well-defined case of it before, and it was almost certain that the living conditions prevailing amongst us would inspire the appearance of the disease, so that we had no proof that any man was so inoculated. Some of the men so affected went to Switzerland for the benefit of the mountain air through an arrangement made by the Red Cross with Swiss authorities. One of our guards was subject to fits, and habitually ran amuck amongst us, abusing some of the prisoners in a painful fashion. We made complaint of this through the proper channels, for which crime the officer in charge stopped our fires and other privileges for the time being. Most of the men wore prison uniforms, or in some cases suits sent from England, which were altered by the authorities to conform to their regulations. These required that if one was not in a distinctive and enemy uniform, that broad stripes of bright-colored cloth be set into the seam of the trousers, not sewed in, but into the goods. A large diamond-shaped piece, or else a square of such cloth, was set into the breast and back of the tunic. I preferred my uniform, dilapidated though it was. We were permitted the choice, probably less out of kindness than because of the saving involved. There was a big, simple giant of a Russian here who was badly sprung at the knees. He had been forced to work during the winter in an underground railway station near Berlin. He had had no shoes and had stood in the water for weeks, digging. He was very badly crippled in the consequence. Some 400 Russians came to us after the fall of Warsaw. They were mostly wounded and all rotten. On the 3 months' march to Giessen, the wounded had received absolutely no attention other than their own. Here we had a crazy German doctor, a mediocre French one, and Canadian orderlies. If an Englishman went to the hospital for treatment, it was, "Vic, get out." These Russians were treated similarly. The French fared better. One big, fine-looking Russian with a filthy mass of rags wound around his arm reported for attention. They unwound the rag and his arm dropped off. He died, with 5 others that afternoon, and God only knows how many more on the trip they had just finished. They were buried in a piano case together. Usually they were placed in packing cases. We asked for a flag which to cover them as soldiers should be. They asked what that was for, and there it ended. They were all thoroughly cowed, as are dogs when they have been ill-treated, and they jumped to it when a German spoke, excepting 2 of their officers, who refused to take down their epaulets when ordered to do so. We did not learn how they fared. These were the only captive officers of any nationality whom we saw. We became sick of the sight of one another, as even the best of friends do under such abnormal conditions. For variety, I often walked around the enclosure with a Russian. Neither of us had the faintest idea of what the other said, but it was a change. The monotony of the wire was terrible, and just outside it, in the lane formed by the encircling set of wire, the dogs, with their tongues out, walked back and forth, eyeing us. There was so little to talk about. We knew nothing and could only speculate on the outcome of the commonest events which came to us on the tongue of rumor, or arose out of our own sad thoughts. The authorities were not satisfied with our recognition or lack of it, of their officers, and took us out to practice saluting drill, a thing always detested by soldiers, especially veterans. The idea was to make us salute visiting German officers properly, in the German fashion and not in our own. Theirs consisted of saluting with the right hand only, with their left held stiffly straight at the side, while ours was to salute with the hand furthest from the officer, giving eyes left or eyes right, as the case might be, and with the free hand swinging loosely with the stride. So a school of us was led out to this. The very atmosphere was tense with sullen rebellion. The guards eyed us askance. The officer stood at the left awaiting us. Beyond him, on the other side of the road, a post. An Officer ordered us to march by, one by one, to give the Herr Officer Augen links in the German fashion, and to the post, which represented another officer, and Augen rechts, when we should come to it. "I'll see him in hell first," I muttered to the man next to me. I was in the lead of the party. I shook with excitement and fear of I know not what. As the command rang out, I stepped out with a swing, and with the action, decision came to me. As I approached the officer, he drew up slightly and looked at me expectantly. I gave him a stony stare and passed on. A few more steps and I reached the post. I pulled back my shoulders with a smart jerk, got my arms to swinging freely, snapped my head around so that my eyes caught the post squarely, and swung my left hand up in a clean-cut parabola to "Eyes right," in good old regimental order. A half-dozen shocked sentries came up on the double. It was they who were excited now. I was master of myself and the situation. The integral officer ordered me to repeat and salute. I did so literally. The officer was, to all outward appearances, the only other person there who remained unmoved. My ardor had cooled by this time, and his very silence seemed worse than the threats of the guard. Nor was I exactly in love with my self-appointed task. Nevertheless, I saw my mates watching me and inwardly applauding. I was ashamed to quit. I did it again. That won me another 5 days' cells. End of chapter 11.